It started like any other quiet week on my ranch. Just me, the animals, and the sound of wind brushing through acres of untouched land. Peaceful, predictable, and exactly why I chose to settle out there. I had worked hard for this land, fenced it myself, marked every boundary, filed every deed. It was mine, legally and without question. So when the rumble of machinery echoed in the distance one morning, it wasn't just out of place, it was alarming. I wasn't expecting deliveries, contractors, or any sort of construction. That kind of sound didn't belong out here without notice. Curious and a little concerned, I hopped on my ATV and rode toward the back corner of the property. That's when I saw it. A group of workers in bright orange vests, unloading drilling equipment and positioning stakes into the soil like they had every right to be there. At first, I assumed they must have made some kind of mistake. Maybe they had the wrong address, or the GPS had led them off course. But as I got closer, I saw something that made my jaw tighten. A white truck bearing the HOA logo of a nearby subdivision I had no affiliation with. I wasn't under their jurisdiction. My land sat far outside their authority. Yet here they were, acting like they ran the place. I parked and walked over, waving to get their attention. One man in particular stepped forward, clipboard in hand, and a grin that screamed condescension. Before I could ask anything, he offered up the explanation like it was some kind of gift. "We're installing a shared well for the community," he said, nodding proudly toward the drill rig. "It's going to improve water access for everyone in the area, including you." His tone suggested he expected gratitude. What he got instead was a stiff silence from me as I processed what I was hearing. I told him, calmly but firmly, that this was private property, my property, and that I had not granted permission for anyone to access it, let alone dig into it. He chuckled like I'd said something cute and gestured toward the clipboard. "You're within our service radius. We assumed you'd be happy to contribute." There was the HOA entitlement in full display. No legal documentation, no prior communication, just pure assumption and audacity. They had decided my land was fair game because it suited their agenda. They thought a vague reference to community improvement would be enough to justify trespassing. I pointed to the boundary markers lining the edge of my land, which they had clearly passed. He gave them a glance, shrugged, and muttered something about lines being flexible in rural zones. That's when I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate. They knew where they were. They just didn't care. They had chosen this spot not because it was right, but because it was convenient. Their HOA jurisdiction didn't extend to my ranch, but they were betting I wouldn't fight back. Or worse, they assumed I didn't know my rights. As I stood there, watching them prep their drill, the absurdity of the situation started to really sink in. This wasn't some neighborly request or collaborative project. It was a group of self-important board members using HOA funds and manpower to encroach on private land, dressed up as civic duty. They didn't ask, they didn't notify, and they clearly didn't think they needed to. The more I challenged them, the more defensive and dismissive they became. One worker even said, "It's just a hole. We'll be done in 2 days." To them, it was just another project checked off their list. To me, it was an illegal invasion of property. They were laying down drilling foundations like they were building a patio in their own backyard. Not once did anyone ask who owned the land. Not once did anyone consult a county plat map. It was like they assumed everything within reach was under their control, and if it wasn't already, it would be soon enough. That's the danger of unchecked power in these homeowner associations. The rules bend in their favor, and if you live nearby, even without membership, you become part of their imaginary empire. I stood my ground, told them in no uncertain terms that they were trespassing and that I would be calling the county. But even as I made those threats, I could tell they didn't take it seriously. In their minds, they were the authority, not the law. And so, despite my protests, the drilling continued. After that first confrontation, I thought maybe the HOA would back off. I had made it clear they were trespassing, that the land they were on was private, and that any continued activity would have legal consequences. But that's not how they operated. The next day, not only were the workers still there, but they had doubled their crew and brought in even heavier equipment. I stood at the edge of my pasture, watching them move like they owned the place, their machinery tearing through the earth just yards from the fence I'd built with my own hands. The arrogance was staggering. They weren't just ignoring my warnings, they were escalating. I walked back out to confront them again. This time, the HOA board president himself was on site, clipboard in hand, sunglasses hiding his eyes like some kind of corporate sheriff. He introduced himself without an ounce of humility, telling me how long he'd served on the board, how many community improvements he'd overseen, and how I was lucky to benefit from this one. He didn't ask if I'd changed my mind. He didn't apologize for the intrusion. He didn't even bother explaining why they had no permits, no survey approvals, and no legal right to be there. Instead, he handed me a brochure. The paper was glossy and full of renderings, diagrams of a sparkling new well, water lines crisscrossing my land like it was public utility space, and quotes about sustainability and regional benefit. It was like a propaganda flyer for a project I never agreed to. My name wasn't on it, but my land certainly was. They had already factored it in, assumed it was theirs to use. In their world, my boundaries didn't matter. Legal property lines were just lines on a drawing they could revise at will. That's when it became painfully clear. They weren't just trespassing, they were rewriting ownership. I brought up the deed, told them, again, that this land was outside their jurisdiction. The HOA president smirked and said, "We've consulted with our legal team. The gray area here gives us some flexibility." Gray area. That's the term they hide behind when they know they're wrong but want to sound official. There was no gray area in my paperwork. No ambiguity in the county records. The only thing murky was their understanding or willful disregard of the law. Yet they acted as if their board decisions carried the same weight as a judge's order. Over the next couple of days, I watched them continue their work, slicing through land that generations of my family had cared for. They stacked tools near my barn, parked their trucks under my trees. One even walked up to my well pump to inspect it as if it were part of their operation. They were testing my limits, seeing how far they could go before I snapped. And it was becoming clear they didn't just misunderstand boundaries. They refused to acknowledge them altogether. Even my neighbors began to notice the absurdity. People who knew where my property started and ended were asking me if I had sold a portion of it or partnered with the HOA on some kind of shared project. That's how public they were making it. They weren't just overstepping. They were broadcasting their control. They were trying to reshape perception through visibility, hoping that if enough people saw them acting like they belonged, it would start to feel like they did. It wasn't just a construction site. It was a performance. I contacted the county and filed a formal complaint. I got in touch with a property lawyer and sent a cease and desist letter. But even that didn't stop them immediately. The HOA board started sending vague responses, filled with legal jargon and vague claims of temporary access rights they couldn't substantiate. It was all stalling tactics, trying to buy time while they completed the drilling. Every action they took was rooted in the assumption that their authority trumped actual ownership. They ignored fences. They ignored records. They ignored every legal and moral cue that said, "You don't belong here." They had made up their minds long before they rolled in. The ranch, in their eyes, was just an obstacle. Not someone's home, not someone's livelihood, not someone's legally protected land. It was a plot on a map that could serve their purposes, and they were willing to bend every rule to make that happen. By the third day, it was obvious they weren't going to stop. The HOA had decided this project was happening, and no legal document, verbal warning, or boundary line was going to change that. I watched as more trucks rolled in, each carrying tools, tanks, pipes, and more workers who clearly thought they were on the right side of things. It wasn't just overconfidence. It was negligence wrapped in arrogance. They were digging deeper, driving equipment further into my land, acting like the absence of police or immediate consequences gave them the green light to keep going. What made it worse was that they hadn't taken even the most basic safety or planning precautions. No surveyors had come out. No flags marked where utility lines or water mains might be. They hadn't contacted the county for digging permits, and they hadn't called 811 to check for buried infrastructure, which by law they were required to do. But they didn't care. This was an HOA operation, and they thought their board meeting decisions held more weight than actual state laws. It wasn't just an illegal project, it was a dangerous one. I asked one of the contractors on site, who I later found out was just a hired general laborer, if they'd done any soil assessment or water flow study before choosing this spot. He looked at me confused and said, "They just told us to dig here." He pointed at a printed email from the HOA board with a GPS pin and a few vague lines about increasing capacity for surrounding homes. That was the extent of their planning. No coordination with civil engineers, no environmental inspection, nothing. Just a few HOA members deciding where to put a well based on what looked good on a Google map. As I watched them work, I started to notice signs that they didn't really understand what they were doing. Their drill setup wasn't professional grade, and the alignment was off. They kept having to adjust for rock layers they hadn't anticipated, wasting hours trying to force their way through terrain they never studied. Water wasn't gushing up. They were barely hitting damp soil. But that didn't stop them. Every hour they pressed on, I grew more convinced they were going to cause a serious problem. The land was old, layered with decades of buried infrastructure. Not just my own, but regional lines that connected much farther than the HOA probably realized. I called the utility district myself, just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. They pulled the records, and sure enough, about 30 feet below the surface in the very area the HOA was digging, lay one of the district's main underground water lines. It wasn't just a private system. It was part of a central grid that served dozens of homes and businesses throughout the area. A rupture there wouldn't just affect me. It would trigger service outages, fines, and possible contamination for hundreds of people. I immediately warned the workers, showed them the schematics from the district, even gave them the number to call. Most of them looked uncomfortable. One even said, "I don't think we should be doing this." But the project lead, hired by the HOA, told them to keep going. That's the thing about this kind of arrogance. It blinds people. The HOA thought they knew best, even when professionals warned them otherwise. They believed their vision for this was more important than legal boundaries, safety protocols, and expert advice. They didn't think they needed permission because they assumed they'd be thanked afterward. They thought the rules applied to other people. Every step of the way, their negligence became more obvious, but so did their determination to push forward no matter what. They had no idea how close they were to creating a catastrophe. The closer they drilled, the more unstable the ground became. The pressure from the equipment started causing minor vibrations that carried farther than they expected. You could feel the rumble from my porch. At one point, I saw a small geyser of muddy water shoot up from the drill site, and one of the workers started shouting. That's when it became real even for them. They weren't just digging a well anymore. They were tampering with something they didn't understand, something that was never theirs to touch. And all of it, every careless step, every ignored warning, every unauthorized decision, stemmed from one thing: the HOA's complete disregard for process, expertise, and responsibility. They didn't consult engineers, they didn't file permits, and they didn't respect the land they were violating. They thought the lack of immediate resistance gave them a right to move forward. The moment they struck something underground, everything changed. It wasn't dramatic at first. No explosion, no burst of water spraying into the sky. Just a strange shudder in the ground and a change in the sound coming from the drill, more of a hollow echo, like something had opened beneath them. The workers stopped. One of them yelled for the rig to shut down. The machine went silent, and for a few seconds, no one moved. Everyone seemed to sense that something had gone wrong, even if they couldn't yet see it. Then the ground started to give way. Not a collapse, but a slow, sinking shift in the dirt around the drill site. It wasn't natural, and it wasn't supposed to happen. A slurry of water and soil began bubbling up from the hole, muddy at first, but then gradually clearer. The workers looked at each other, confused and concerned, clearly not expecting this much water, or any water, so soon. They hadn't installed containment barriers or proper drainage for runoff. Within minutes, the drill site was flooded. I stood a few yards away, watching it unfold with a mix of dread and grim certainty. I already knew what they had done, even before confirmation came. The HOA had tapped into the main district water line, a large pressurized pipe buried deep beneath my land, designed to supply water across multiple communities. It wasn't something anyone should have touched, much less a group of overconfident board members with no permits and no technical oversight. They had just compromised critical infrastructure, and the consequences would be far-reaching. Within the hour, the district's emergency services were notified. I had already filed complaints, so when I called to report the breach, they took it seriously. A crew arrived faster than I expected, trucks, utility vans, and engineers piling out and surrounding the site. The HOA workers and board members who were so confident earlier suddenly looked like school kids caught cheating on an exam. The professionals took one look at the damage and immediately shut down the area. No more digging, no more equipment running. This was no longer a construction project. It was now an active utility hazard. The lead engineer confirmed what I had feared. The drill had punctured a section of the water main, causing a breach in the line. Water was being forced up through the hole they had made, losing pressure across the district. That meant homes and businesses connected to the line were already experiencing reduced flow or complete outages. What's worse, the contamination risk was real. The slurry of dirt and groundwater now mixing into the main line could affect water quality if not sealed and flushed in time. One careless act, and now hundreds of people might be without clean water for days. The HOA president tried to argue, claiming they didn't know the line was there. He even had the nerve to suggest that the district hadn't marked it properly, despite never filing a dig request in the first place. But the utility crew wasn't having it. They pulled out documentation showing the line's location, depth, and protections. Everything was properly logged. The HOA had simply failed to do even the most basic due diligence before digging. It wasn't just a mistake, it was negligence, plain and simple. As the utility crew worked to contain the damage, the mood shifted completely. The HOA board members who had strutted around the property days earlier now avoided eye contact. They huddled together, whispering with their phones out, likely contacting lawyers or trying to figure out how to spin this into anything other than what it was, a total disaster of their own making. The workers packed up their gear slowly, unsure if they were going to get paid or be named in the inevitable legal proceedings. Meanwhile, I stood by, answering questions from the utility crew, providing property records and photos of the dig site before and after. I had everything documented, the letters I sent, the warnings I gave, the maps I showed. It was all on file, and now it served as evidence. I wasn't just protecting my land anymore. I was now part of a formal investigation into an HOA's unlawful excavation and the damage caused to district infrastructure. What made it worse was how preventable it all was. One phone call, one permit application, one consultation with the right engineer could have stopped this. But instead, they moved forward with arrogance, ignoring the risks because they thought the rules didn't apply to them. They saw land, saw opportunity, and thought their position gave them the power to act without consequence. As the water continued to bubble up from the ground and the utility crews worked overtime to shut off the flow, it became clear just how massive the damage truly was. The line they had struck wasn't a small feeder pipe or auxiliary channel. It was a primary artery in the district's water infrastructure, pressurized, deeply buried, and engineered to last decades without interference. It was never meant to be touched, especially not by an HOA acting far beyond its jurisdiction. What they thought would be a routine drill had turned into a full-blown infrastructure emergency. Word spread quickly. Within hours, nearby neighborhoods began reporting brown water, low pressure, or no water at all. The district's helpline was overwhelmed. Schools were forced to close early. Small businesses had to shut down operations. People who depended on daily water supply for work or health reasons were suddenly scrambling for answers, all while the HOA that caused it tried to keep the situation quiet. But there was no way to hide it anymore. The damage wasn't isolated. It had triggered a chain reaction across the area, all because they thought they could dig a hole wherever they wanted. The utility district set up emergency repair operations on my property, bringing in excavation equipment, water tankers, and temporary filtration units. My once peaceful ranch now looked like a cross between a construction zone and a crisis response center. Workers operated in shifts around the clock, trying to isolate the breach and reroute water while minimizing further disruption. The air smelled of damp soil and diesel. Floodlights lit the night like a football stadium. I barely slept during those days, not because of the noise, but because of the sheer disbelief at how badly the HOA had messed things up. What stunned me more than anything else was their continued denial. Even after the breach, even after the official reports started piling up, the HOA board doubled down. They released a community newsletter blaming the incident on unforeseen underground anomalies and framed their unauthorized dig as a well-intentioned project that was interrupted by unexpected interference. Not one word about the lack of permits, the ignored warnings, or the repeated trespassing. They tried to rebrand the disaster as a learning experience rather than take accountability for their recklessness. The legal side of things moved fast. The utility district immediately began preparing litigation to recover the costs of emergency repairs and lost service. I was contacted by multiple attorneys, some representing the district, some independent, who told me that I would likely be entitled to compensation as well, given the intrusion onto my land and the environmental damage caused by the breach. Soil contamination, structural disturbance, potential erosion, all of it needed to be assessed and repaired, and all of it traced back to the unauthorized well project. The HOA wasn't just looking at fines. They were looking at lawsuits from multiple directions. Meanwhile, I started to document everything. Every piece of broken pipe, every section of ground that had been dug up, every interaction with the board. I recorded conversations, saved emails, and had aerial drone footage taken to show the full extent of the damage. What had started as a personal property violation had now become a multi-agency case involving water safety, land rights, and civil liability. The evidence was overwhelming, and the people responsible couldn't hide behind good intentions anymore. What really hit me was the reaction from the community once the truth started coming out. At first, many residents had believed the HOA's version of events. But once the district confirmed the breach was caused by unauthorized digging and that no permits had ever been filed, public opinion shifted hard. Homeowners who had supported the board began demanding resignations. Emergency meetings were called. Petitions started circulating to dissolve the board entirely or replace it with new leadership. The same people who had once looked at the HOA as protectors of property values now saw them as liabilities. My neighbors, many of whom I'd barely spoken to before all this, started stopping by to apologize. Some brought meals. Others offered to help with cleanup, or just came by to say they couldn't believe how badly the situation had been mishandled. It was a strange silver lining in the middle of the chaos, watching people come together, not in support of the HOA, but in defense of fairness, safety, and common sense. It was clear that even those who lived within the HOA's boundaries had no idea how far their board was willing to go or how blind they had become to consequences. And in the middle of all of it, I just kept thinking about how easily it all could have been avoided. With the district's engineers still working around the clock and the legal process beginning to take shape, I found myself in a position I never expected, holding all the leverage. The HOA had walked onto my land, acted like they owned it, ignored every warning, and caused thousands of gallons of water to spill from the main line. What they didn't realize was that their misstep hadn't just caused property damage or service interruptions. It had created a legal opening that I could now step through with undeniable force. The very violation they committed would become the wedge I needed to assert full control over the entire water access issue in the area. As the investigation unfolded, more details began to surface. The HOA's board hadn't just skipped permits. They'd actually been advised not to proceed with the well installation in that location. An internal email chain, recovered by one of the lawyers, showed a board member raising concerns about drilling near utility lines. That concern was brushed aside. The decision to proceed anyway was deliberate. They believed, arrogantly, that once the project was complete, no one would care how it got done. But now those emails became critical pieces of evidence, proving gross negligence. My property lawyer advised that we push forward, not just for compensation, but to renegotiate water rights and access easements throughout the entire region. It turned out that my ranch sat on a critical corridor that was grandfathered into water distribution decades ago, giving me certain rights that had been dormant but never revoked. The HOA's mistake activated those rights. Because they had violated them without consent, I now had legal standing to demand control over water usage that affected not just my land, but several adjoining properties. We filed a claim to formally revoke any implied access the HOA had previously assumed. At the same time, the utility district supported our move by releasing a public statement clarifying that my property was not within HOA control and that all decisions involving that land had to go through the district and me directly. In short, the HOA lost its grip. All of their plans to establish a central well system had depended on my land, and now that land was not only off limits, it was under stricter control than ever before. The fallout inside the HOA was immediate and ugly. Board members began blaming each other. A few quietly resigned. Residents demanded transparency and accountability, flooding meetings with questions that no one on the board could answer. The community that had once given them blind authority now saw the cracks, and the illusion of control started to crumble. Meanwhile, I wasn't just sitting back. I met with district officials and began negotiating a long-term agreement that would allow for controlled water access in the area on my terms. The irony didn't escape me. They had trespassed, drilled, and damaged everything thinking they were expanding their influence. But the only thing they expanded was my legal power. I now had the ability to approve or deny future water development projects near my land. The district gave me the right to review new proposals before they moved forward. I even negotiated a clause that allowed for independent environmental review, paid for by the HOA, before any new water infrastructure could be proposed within a half-mile of my property. What had started as an act of overreach ended in a complete reversal of power. Every time the HOA tried to push back, they were met with resistance not just from me, but from the very agencies they once claimed to speak for. The district had no interest in shielding them. The liability they'd created was too large to ignore, and no one wanted to risk a repeat of the disaster they'd caused. The board's legal fees piled up. Residents became furious when they learned their dues were being used to defend a lawsuit that could have been avoided with one phone call and a little humility. Even better, I was approached by independent property owners in the area, some of whom had also experienced minor disputes with the HOA over the years. They wanted to know how I did it, how I took on the board and won. I shared everything I'd learned, how to research old easements, how to request public infrastructure maps, how to document every incident. It became clear that I wasn't the only one fed up with HOA overreach. I was just the one who had the leverage to do something about it, and the HOA had handed me that leverage through their own carelessness. Now, when the HOA wants to install anything that even remotely touches water systems, they have to send a notice to my attorney's office. They can't plan a water conservation project, suggest a sprinkler upgrade near the boundary, or even propose a runoff collection site without going through multiple layers of approval, including mine. They lost the ability to act unilaterally. They lost the illusion of invincibility. They lost the narrative they had created for years, the one where they always knew what was best for the community.